Irish migrations in the 1840s and the Italians in the late 1800s and the early 1900s into New York, that was a migration of 20, 30, 40 years. The Latino migration, especially into New York City, beginning with Puerto Ricans, is going to continue to the end of this century. It's going to be a migration probably of 150 years in terms of length. People don't even really grasp yet, I don't think, the enormous demographic transformation that's occurring, but it's entirely possible that the entire United States, by the end of this century, a majority of the people will trace their origin to Latin America. So you're seeing basically the total demographic transformation of the nation. And in many ways, the Puerto Rican migration into New York was the sign of what was to come and what has continued to occur, not just in New York, but throughout the country. There had been a small migration of Puerto Ricans after World War I, and obviously there had been Spanish-speaking people in New York, mostly Cubans in the late 19th century. But really, it wasn't until World War II that you had the huge influxes into New York City, beginning with Puerto Ricans. Part of the problem for Americans to understand this huge migration change is to understand what propelled the people to come. Both Puerto Ricans who were U.S. citizens, but also the Mexicans and the Ecuadorians and the Dominicans who came after them. Every one of those countries had major problems, very often as a result of our own government's policies there. And several of them faced years of the most brutal kind of dictatorships that were supported by the United States. Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, the Somozas in Nicaragua, Batista in Cuba, all of these were allies of the United States. All of them repressed their countries, and all of them basically were pliant supporters of the needs of American business in their countries. As a result, the economies of all these countries were distorted, and so much of the wealth of the countries left the country, left and came here. So that the migrants then were basically forced to leave. They had no choice if they were going to survive but to leave their country, and the easiest place to leave to, because of all the economic ties, the transportation and communication that had already been established, was the United States.
The 30s were really hard in Puerto Rico, terrible. There was a lot of political tumult, grinding poverty, because a lot of American policies had discouraged agriculture and really destroyed agriculture as an industry in Puerto Rico, except for smallholder plots. And so this tremendous immigration took off in the years after the Second World War, but it took off because of the earlier Latin presence in New York, which made it a place with Spanish institutions. You could go to Mass and pray in Spanish. You could say your confession in Spanish. You could join the Lions Club and be there with the other members in Spanish. And that's why, after 1945, along with the terrible poverty that persisted in Puerto Rico, there was a place to go that was not on the island where you could still be you. I don't think people even got how hard it was going to be for them, but because of those generations of anchor people who moved up to what became Spanish Harlem, who moved to East New York and Williamsburg and the South Bronx, this was able to happen.
My family came here in 1946, right after World War II. The war played a critical role. There were 65,000 Puerto Ricans who fought in the U.S. Army in World War II. My father and both of his brothers all were in the Puerto Rican Regiment, the 65th Infantry. And so the Puerto Ricans who were U.S. citizens and who also had fought in the war and helped defeat fascism, the conditions were so bad in their own island that they said, well, let's go to the United States.
This immigration is different. The Puerto Ricans come not by ship, huddled in the steerage, but by plane. Being U.S. citizens, they beat at no immigration bars. Never had their picture taken in colorful native costume. behind the wire enclosures of Ellis Island. They simply seeped in, landing by their 20s and 30s from battered planes at LaGuardia Field in Newark, suddenly appearing beside their cardboard suitcases on the city's sidewalks outside a hole-in-the-wall travel agency. To them, the U.S. means New York City, and 300,000 of them now live in its 5 boroughs. Time magazine.
I think in 1946 there was something like 46,000 Puerto Ricans arrived in 1 year. You're talking about 1,000 people a week almost were coming from the island. And you had the first great airborne migration in world history, I think, because they were all coming by plane for the most part as the new airlines were opening up their services. So that by 1960, you had close to 1 million Puerto Ricans in the United States, most of them right here in New York City.
Caribbeans, because of the change in technology, because of the change in transportation, because of the change of the pace of life, often came as sojourners, never assuming that they were going to spend the rest of their lives in places that they knew were called Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx and Harlem. The difference was that they could go back, but often didn't. They could pick up a phone and speak to their mother, their brother, their cousins, their grandparents. So their poverty kept those places far away, but technology made them closer. So they came often as people who did not think they were giving the rest of their lives to this new place, and then surprised themselves when they did. They, as many immigrants did, moved to the oldest housing in the worst neighborhoods and remained strangers to the people around them for a long time. My family came in the late 40s and early 50s, sort of one person by one as they could afford to bring more. And in those years, there were jobs in service industries, there were jobs in factories, there were jobs for seamstresses, there were jobs in breweries, there were things to do. It was a way out into a country that was actually growing faster than any place on earth. But when we look at how we extol the generations of Ellis Island immigrants and we show sepia photographs shot in this golden light of people in cloth caps and clearly archaic-looking layers of skirts with little American flags, we love those people. And I'm not sure we've ever loved immigrants from the rest of the hemisphere in quite the same way.
Initially, the Puerto Ricans were largely invisible. For the most part, because it was a working class migration, it didn't attract much attention. And in East Harlem, which became gradually the biggest center for the Puerto Rican community, the Puerto Ricans were sort of squeezed between the Italians, who lived largely along First Avenue and Second Avenue and up to Third Avenue in East Harlem, and the African American community in Harlem. So you basically had the Puerto Ricans sort of almost as a buffer zone between the Italians and the African Americans, between the white and the black community. And interestingly, for the early parts of the migration, there was a lot of unity in East Harlem, largely because of the political leadership at the time. Vito Marcantonio was the congressman for decades in East Harlem, and he was very actively involved in Puerto Rican affairs and was well loved in the Puerto Rican community. But Marcantonio was finally ousted in 1950. And my aunt always tells the story that on the night that Marcantonio was defeated is when really racial tensions became strong and began to evolve in East Harlem. That was sort of the beginning of the development of gangs as some whites started to increasingly target Puerto Ricans then developed their own gangs, the Viceroys and the Dragons, and various other gangs to defend themselves. And that was sort of the beginning of deep racial tensions between the white and the Puerto Rican community. Obviously what made West Side Story, then the big hit a few years later. West Side Story, in essence, created the Puerto Rican for all of America. For the rest of the country, for decades, the image of knife-wielding Puerto Ricans was the main image. And it really had an enormous impact on the psyche of how Americans viewed the Puerto Rican as someone prone to crime, prone to violence. Whereas the image of the Puerto Rican worker, of the one who toiled away in the hotel or in the restaurant, cleaning the office buildings, was rarely invoked and rarely thought about.
If there's one thing I would say that makes the Puerto Rican contribution distinctive, is that it was a pioneering spirit. Puerto Ricans came in the 40s and 50s and they changed not just the landscape, but they fought, for civil rights, and they demanded services, and they integrated schools, and they integrated neighborhoods, and they fought a lot of battles that I think Latinos coming to the city today take for granted.
Well, I think one way that Puerto Ricans dramatically changed the city was in terms of the question of language. Because, again, people often forget this. Puerto Ricans came here as U.S. citizens already. They were born on the island as U.S. citizens after 1917, when Congress declared all Puerto Rican citizens. But they had been speaking Spanish on the island for over 400 years. So when Puerto Ricans came here to the United States, they weren't coming to a foreign country. They were coming to another part of their own country. So they really felt that they had a right to speak Spanish. Many wanted to learn English. My grandmother never learned English. My grandmother came here in 1946, and she died here at the age of 82 and never spoke a word of English. But they felt that this was their country, but Spanish was their language. So I think when the Puerto Ricans opened up the linguistic issue in New York City, it made New York City eventually a more of a welcoming place for other Latino migrants. Because basically the Puerto Ricans paved the way for the acceptance of the Spanish language in government business, in voting, in a normal course of operations. And of course the Puerto Ricans opened all the original bodegas.
Bodegas were not just, the livelihood, but bodegas were kind of the center when there were no community-based organizations. The bodega was where you could find out about jobs, find out about an apartment. You could get someone to help you with translation if you needed to go to seek city services. And so bodegas were always a very kind of vibrant part, of the community. And then, of course, the Puerto Ricans sold the bodegas to the Dominicans.
So now all the bodegas in New York are owned by Dominicans. The whole idea of the neighborhood bodega, which is now an accepted part of New York's culture, and that Spanish is a language spoken in this city. I think that was all part of what the Puerto Ricans did initially and made it a more welcoming place for the Cubans and the Dominicans and the Colombians who came after them. There was virtually no Dominican migration to the United States in the 1950s, none. But once Trujillo was assassinated in 1961, and then of course after the U.S. invasion in 1965, suddenly then thousands of Dominicans came to the United States. And the U.S. government allowed them to come because it wanted to relieve the tension in the country. So you had, beginning in 1965, 66, 67, this huge development of the second big Latino community in the United States. The Manhattan Valley and the Upper West Side of Manhattan, then later spread to Queens. And then, of course, gradually, as the Upper West Side of Manhattan became gentrified, all the Dominicans from Manhattan Valley moved north to the City College area and eventually up to Washington Heights. And you had the development of what is now known as the big Dominican community in New York City, Washington Heights. Well, there's no doubt that when the United States government adopted more expanded immigration policy and eliminated the quota systems with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that it had a dramatic effect on the demographic composition of the country and dramatically increased the number of Latin American and Caribbean immigrants.
Hart-Celler in 1965 throws the door open and opens America, not to Belgium or to France or to West Germany, but to the world. And that changes everything. And it makes a new New York. It had far-reaching consequences that will create that next America that we're looking for in 2042 when the two numbers flip and America has a non-white majority.
You know, the United States has always been a country in the process of becoming, always developing its identity as each new wave of immigrants come to the country. So I think that in that sense, the Latino migration is renewing the country. It's renewing the cities. New York City in the 1960s and 70s was losing population as whites fled to the suburbs and the inner cities were left decaying. But what happened beginning in the 80s and the 90s is this huge infusion of Latin American and Caribbean and to some degree Asian immigrants rebuilt the cities through their labor. And so what happened is that the Latino migrants became the underpinning sort of like of the renaissance of the American city in the late 80s and 90s, so that the city has been growing in population, been growing in vibrancy. And I think a good portion of it is due to the massive Latino migration and this willingness to persevere and work and build a future, even sometimes when you are technically not legally in the country. I think the huge surprise for me is the astonishing growth of the Mexican population in New York, so far away from the Mexican border. I think that's going to be one of the great surprises of the 2010 census. And it basically shows, and so many of the Mexicans in New York come from one state, Puebla. One person settles in a place, and that person brings their brothers and their sisters, and they bring their cousins, and they bring the people from their town. And little by little, the communities get transplanted. And so East Harlem is so much more now a Mexican community than it is a Puerto Rican community.
We're back now to having this very cosmopolitan city. You're getting tremendous demographic change. In 1980, there were about 40,000 Mexicans in New York City. Today, there are about 500,000. So in the space of 30 years, you've gone more than tenfold in terms of an increase. In grammar schools here, you've got 50, 60, 70% Latino. In some of them, most of them Mexican, half undocumented. You have booming businesses all over the place, immigrant businesses that were not here 10 years ago.
For me, most of what I know about being Hispanic, I've learned in New York. I'm in New York, born and raised, been here all my life, and so my Hispanic reality is here. There's a piece of music by Willie Colón. It's actually called Nueva York. And in the song he says, "En tus calles de acero, yo vi por primera vez las tradiciones de mis abuelos." And it's literally, on your sidewalks of New York, I learned for the first time the traditions of my grandparents, of my abuelos. And that is, Nueva York. That is the New York experience for those of us born and raised here, because for many of us, all that we know about that heritage we describe ourselves with, that flag we wrap ourselves in, whether we're Colombian or Dominican, many of us have never been to that place, that physical place. It's a place that lives in our heart.
As the Latino population of the city became increasingly diversified, there was a potential for ethnic rivalry developing between the various Latino groups. But to some degree, the discrimination they all felt from the dominant society forced the Latinos, the Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans, and the Cubans and the Colombians, and increasingly now the Mexicans and the Ecuadorians, to build stronger ties with each other, to support each other's political candidates, to build common institutions. And so I think that as a result, the influence of the Latinos politically in the city grew dramatically because of that enforced solidarity. When Fernando Ferrer, for instance, ran for mayor of New York, he got the highest percentage of votes in the Dominican community in Washington Heights, because the Dominicans saw Fernando Ferrer, the Puerto Rican, as moving their aspirations forward and giving them an opportunity to develop. So I think there's a gradual coalescing of a Latino identity.
Here in New York, we're creating a new person. A Latin American whose origins don't lie in just one other country, but often in several. Now there are more kids whose mother is Dominican and their father is Puerto Rican, or their father is Mexican and their mother is Cuban, and they listen to different music that's created here in this crazy mixing bowl of influences and styles. You know, reggaeton starts in the housing projects in San Juan, but really takes root here in New York. Daddy Yankee doesn't wear a Cangrejeros baseball cap. He doesn't wear a San Juan Senadores jersey. He wears a Yankee cap. And that NY says something about him being that binational person. All those old boundaries between norteño and Mexican pop and salsa and reggaeton, all those boundaries are being smashed because the axis of cultural power is swinging away from San Juan and Miami and Rio and Mexico City and toward the north, where the United States is going to take its place as one of the largest Spanish-speaking countries on earth and create its own art and create its own fusion of people who are growing up in America of Latin American origin, who carry both with them into their creative expression. All those old cultural categories are being swept away by the power of numbers, by the power of commerce, by the power of attraction. It's an enormous new idea, a pan-Latin idea.
Well, I think that what's hopeful to me is that that fusion, that amalgamation that is occurring within Latino groups is also helping to propel a greater racial, linguistic, and cultural amalgamation in the entire country. Obviously, you see it most of all in music, because music is always the art form that most borrows from one people's culture and another. So you see this enormous musical fusion that is occurring between Latinos and African Americans and whites in the country, and they are these new hybrid musical forms that have developed over the years, and not simply jazz, but now hip-hop and reggaeton and all of these other musical forms that have developed now that are really showing that people can find ways to understand and share the richness of their experiences, and that it is not simply a question of disparate or alien cultures hitting up against each other.
Salsa. More than hip hop, because of my generation, I'm not a hip hop person. I'm a salsa person. And salsa was so important for my generation, and it was born here in New York. And it was born out of my people from all Latin America and all the Caribbean. They all came together and did for the rest of the world salsa. I think that salsa does not surrender from its tradition, but is able to reframe it. So it's like being wise of what you already know and being proud of it, but being able to get what the others are doing, understand what the others are doing, get what the others are bringing to you, listen to them, let it pour, don't feel any kind of fear of the other, and make your own world understandable for the others. Impure as you can get, without forgetting whom you are and what you learned as a kid, as a child, what you learned when you were a baby. And without being irrespectful, playing with yours and with the others' traditions and putting it all together. All Latino America flavors mixed together, and also the Afro-American musical and the Harlem experience. So it's all like really mixes, and the final flavor is Latino American. Well, it's salsa. You know it's so new, but you know it's not. It carries its memories perfectly deep and is full of wisdom. It's no ignorance contained there. That's what our cooks do in New York. There's no ignorance contained there. And that's what our new writers will do here. There won't be any ignorance. Yes, probably their parents didn't know how to read and write, but they knew their stories by heart. They had an oral tradition, and that is going to appear there. And is going to have first-class polishment, because it's going to be done in New York. This is a city where people want to do the best of their thing, and that contaminates people, and that's good.
Isn't that great, a city that in its name has the newness factor included? You know, it is a city definitely that has to reinvent itself by the DNA of its name, and it was founded in that kind of spirit. I think it was founded with the notion also of escaping other realities and transforming this, Manhattan as a utopian land, and then Nueva York by extension, into the realm of possibilities. So I think it has had from the onset that kind of attraction, a magnet to people who really needed to escape another reality, to bring the possibilities to a city that welcomes the newness, that includes it in its name, that is reinventing itself day in, day out. And I think that is what brings still hope and resilience, even in the worst moments of the city. The notion that better things are coming and that we can reinvent ourselves.
It's the house of everybody. That's why people like it so much. And I think that's what we as Latino Americans have to profit from, seeing that we are builders of that, because we enter into this process of all belonging to a world that is in common, a post-national reality.
We have to deal with the fact that in an increasingly globalized world, where capital insists on tearing down all barriers to move wherever it wants to, the other side of that is labor has to be able to survive and has to be able to move. And so what we are seeing is the other side of globalization. Immigration is the other side of globalization, the human side of globalization. How does an increasingly interconnected world in business deal with the interconnected world of labor? And how do people survive? And I think that's what immigration really represents. We are becoming more international. And as we become more international, it's not just being able to trade on 20 exchanges all over the world at the same time. It's also what happens to the people who end up being affected by all that trading and speculation and investment that's flying around the world at lightning speed. That is all of that is Nueva York, yes. Yes.